He thought humiliating her would earn him respect, but he had no idea he was about to lose it in front of everyone who mattered. Emily Carter stepped through the glass doors of Iron Forge Gym just past 6:10 p.m., the golden hour light stretching across polished mats and mirrored walls, catching on chrome equipment and framed certificates that whispered prestige. At first glance, she didn't belong. Her gray hoodie was slightly worn at the cuffs, her sneakers clean but inexpensive, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail that suggested practicality over style. Around her, conversations hummed, students in branded gear, black belts adjusting uniforms, laughter echoing with the easy confidence of those who believed they had already proven themselves. Emily moved quietly along the edge of the room, her footsteps light, almost careful, as if she had learned long ago not to draw attention unless necessary. But attention found her anyway. Jason Blake noticed her within seconds. Standing near the center of the mat, his black belt tied perfectly, posture straight, voice carrying authority without effort. He was everything this place represented: discipline, hierarchy, reputation. He had built that reputation over years, earning not just skill, but admiration, and he guarded it fiercely. His eyes scanned the room the way they always did, measuring, evaluating, categorizing. And when they landed on Emily, they paused just a fraction longer than usual. There was something about her stillness that didn't fit. Not weakness, not confidence either. Something else. But Jason didn't like uncertainty. He preferred clarity, control. And in his world, people like Emily were easy to define. "You here for the beginner class?" he called out, his tone casual, but edged just enough to draw a few smirks from nearby students. Heads turned. Conversations softened. Emily looked up, meeting his gaze without flinching, her expression calm, almost neutral. "I'm here to train," she replied softly. The simplicity of her answer seemed to amuse him. A few students chuckled under their breath. Jason stepped closer, slow and deliberate, the kind of movement designed to command space. "This isn't a cardio class," he said, his voice just loud enough for others to hear. "We take things seriously here. More laughter. Not loud, not cruel, just enough to create that subtle pressure, that invisible line between those who belonged and those who didn't." Emily nodded once, as if acknowledging something obvious. "I understand." For a brief moment, Jason studied her again. There it was, that same quiet steadiness. No defensiveness, no embarrassment, no attempt to prove herself. It unsettled him more than he expected. Around them, the energy shifted slightly, curiosity replacing amusement. A few students leaned in, sensing something unscripted unfolding. Jason felt it too, and instinctively, he moved to reclaim control. "All right," he said, clapping his hands once, the sharp sound echoing across the room. "Let's see what you've got." The words were framed like an invitation, but the tone carried something else entirely. A test, a setup, a moment designed not to reveal her, but to define her in front of everyone watching. Someone in the back pulled out a phone. Another student whispered, barely containing a grin. The air grew tighter, heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Emily stepped forward onto the mat. No hesitation, no performance, just one quiet step that seemed to absorb the noise around her rather than compete with it. The lights above reflected faintly in her eyes, steady and unreadable. And for the first time since she walked in, Jason Blake felt something unfamiliar settle beneath his confidence. Not doubt, not yet, just a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. The kind of feeling that comes right before everything changes. The room felt just a little quieter. The moment Emily's foot settled on the mat, the entire gym seemed to recalibrate around her, as if every conversation, every movement, every breath had quietly shifted in her direction. Jason gestured toward the far side of the training area, where a group of advanced students had been practicing controlled combinations, their movements sharp and synchronized. "Ryan," Jason called out, his voice steady, confident, "why do not you step in for a demonstration?" A tall man in his early 30s turned, adjusting the sleeve of his uniform as he approached. Ryan Mitchell was not just another student. He was one of Jason's best, a brown belt known for precision, consistency, and an almost mechanical discipline that had earned him respect throughout the gym. He glanced at Emily, then back at Jason, a subtle question in his eyes. Jason gave a small nod, the kind that carried unspoken instruction. "Keep it simple. Keep it clean. Make the point. Ryan stepped onto the mat, offering a polite, professional nod to Emily. Just a light drill, he said, his tone respectful, though there was a trace of uncertainty beneath it. Emily returned the nod, her posture relaxed, her hands loosely at her sides. Around them, students formed a loose circle, instinctively creating space for what they assumed would be a brief and predictable exchange. A few leaned against the mirrored wall, arms crossed, expressions already halfway to amusement. Someone whispered, "This will be quick," and a quiet ripple of agreement followed. Jason stood just outside the circle, arms folded, watching closely. This was the moment he had engineered. A controlled environment, a clear hierarchy, a simple outcome. He had done this before. Not to embarrass, he would say, but to maintain standards, to remind everyone where they stood. "All right," Jason said, raising one hand slightly. "Let us keep it controlled. Ryan, show her the basics." The instructions sounded generous, but the implication was unmistakable. Teach. Demonstrate. Define the gap. Ryan took a measured step forward, his movements deliberate, rehearsed, confident in their familiarity. Emily did not move. Not immediately. Her gaze followed him, not with tension, but with a kind of quiet attentiveness, as if she were studying something she had already seen many times before. The gym lights reflected softly off the polished floor, casting faint shadows that stretched and shifted with each subtle motion. The air felt heavier now, the earlier laughter replaced by a low, expectant silence. Ryan initiated the first movement, slow and controlled, exactly as instructed. It was clean, technically sound, the kind of motion that instructors praised for its discipline. And then something changed. Not in Ryan. In Emily. It was almost imperceptible at first. A slight adjustment of her stance. A shift of weight that seemed effortless, natural, like someone stepping into a rhythm they had not forgotten. Her hands rose just enough to meet the moment. Not tense, not defensive, simply present. Jason's eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned forward a fraction, something in his posture tightening. Around the circle, a few students exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from amusement to curiosity. There was no dramatic movement, no sudden burst, just a quiet alignment, as if Emily had stepped into a language the room did not realize she spoke fluently. Ryan paused for a split second, just long enough to register that something felt different. Not wrong, not threatening, just unfamiliar. He reset his stance, preparing to continue, this time, with a touch more focus. The circle tightened unconsciously, bodies leaning in, breaths held just a little longer. Jason felt it again, that same flicker from before, now sharper, more defined. Control was still his. The structure was still his. But the certainty he relied on had begun to shift, and he could feel it in the silence that settled over the room. Deeper now, heavier, as if everyone was waiting for something they could not yet name. Ryan moved again, this time with a sharper edge to his focus, his steps measured but no longer casual, as if some instinct inside him had quietly adjusted the stakes of what was supposed to be a simple demonstration. Emily did not retreat, did not rush, did not react the way a beginner would. Instead, she shifted just enough to meet the moment, her movement smooth and economical, like someone conserving energy, because she knew exactly how much was needed and nothing more. There was no strain in her posture, no visible effort, just a quiet precision that began to stand out against the polished routine everyone else had grown used to. The difference was subtle, but it was there, and once noticed, it could not be unseen. A faint murmur rippled through the circle, quickly swallowed by the thickening silence. Jason's arms remained crossed, but his fingers tightened slightly against his sleeves, a detail small enough to escape most eyes, but not the ones paying attention. Ryan stepped in again, adjusting his timing, his movements now more deliberate, testing rather than demonstrating. Emily responded with the same calm rhythm, her feet gliding across the mat in short, controlled steps, never rushed, never off balance. It was not flashy, it was not dramatic, but it was exact. Each motion seemed to arrive a fraction of a second before it was needed, as if she had already seen what was coming. Ryan paused again, this time longer, his brow tightening just slightly. He was not confused. He was recalculating. Around them, the atmosphere shifted further, curiosity giving way to something quieter, something heavier. A few students who had been leaning casually against the wall now stood upright. One lowered his phone without realizing it. Another took a slow step closer to the edge of the mat. No one laughed anymore. No one whispered. The space had transformed from a stage for entertainment into something else entirely, something none of them had planned for. Jason took a single step forward, his voice cutting through the silence, controlled but firmer now. "Keep it moving," he said, as if reminding himself as much as anyone else that this was still his class, his structure, his control. Ryan nodded slightly, drawing in a steady breath before continuing, this time with a level of attention that matched the growing tension in the room. Emily's eyes remained steady, focused not on Ryan as a person, but on the movement itself, as if she were reading a pattern rather than facing an opponent. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when their timing aligned perfectly, and in that instant, the difference between practice and mastery became visible. It was not about speed. It was not about strength. It was about awareness, about understanding the space between actions, about knowing what came next before it arrived. Jason saw it. He could not deny it now. The certainty that had anchored him at the beginning of this moment began to loosen, replaced by something far less comfortable. Recognition, not of who she was, but of what she was not. She was not a beginner. She was not uncertain. And she was not here by accident. Ryan stepped back, just half a pace, enough to reset, enough to acknowledge what he was feeling without saying it out loud. His respect had shifted, quietly but completely. He was no longer demonstrating. He was engaged. The circle tightened again, the air thick with anticipation, every eye locked on the center of the mat. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxed, her stance unchanged, as if none of this tension touched her. But something had changed, not in her movement, but in how the room saw it. What had begun as a simple exercise had turned into a question no one had expected to ask, and no one in that room, not even Jason Blake, knew how it was about to be answered. The silence that settled over the mat was no longer curiosity. It was tension, thick and undeniable, the kind that made even the smallest movement feel amplified. Ryan adjusted his stance again, slower this time, more deliberate, his earlier confidence replaced with something sharper, more respectful. He was no longer following Jason's instruction to demonstrate. He was responding to Emily. And that shift did not go unnoticed. Jason's jaw tightened slightly as he stepped closer to the edge of the circle, his presence pressing into the moment like a reminder that this was still his domain. "Do not overthink it," he said, his voice controlled but carrying an edge that had not been there before. "Keep it simple." But the words did not land the same way they had earlier. The room had already moved past simple. Ryan nodded, though his eyes never left Emily. He moved forward again, his motion clean, disciplined, but now layered with intention. Emily met him with the same quiet composure, her feet adjusting with minimal movement, her posture aligned as if guided by something deeper than conscious thought. There was no hesitation in her response, no delay, no correction. It was as if she was not reacting at all, but simply existing one step ahead of whatever came next. A faint sound echoed from the far side of the gym, someone shifting their weight, another setting down a water bottle more carefully than usual, unwilling to break the atmosphere that had taken hold. The mirrored walls reflected the circle of students, their faces no longer amused, no longer dismissive, but focused, drawn into something they did not fully understand, yet could not look away from. Ryan stepped in again, this time faster, testing the rhythm, testing the boundaries. Emily moved with him, not against him, her motion blending seamlessly into his, redirecting without force, guiding without resistance. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer, stretched by the weight of every eye watching. When it ended, Ryan took a full step back, his breathing steady, but his expression changed. There was no embarrassment there, no frustration, only recognition. He lowered his hands slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that did not need words. Around the circle, the reaction was immediate but silent. A few students straightened completely, their attention sharpened. One of the more experienced black belts near the wall narrowed his eyes, studying Emily with a level of scrutiny usually reserved for advanced demonstrations. Someone in the back whispered a single word, barely audible. "How?" Jason heard it. He heard all of it. And for the first time, He did not have an immediate answer. He stepped forward onto the mat, closing the distance just enough to reassert his presence, though something in his posture had shifted, almost imperceptibly. Again, he said, this time not to instruct, but to confirm. Ryan glanced at Emily, waiting. She gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, her breathing even, her stance relaxed yet precise. There was no sign of strain, no hint of effort. Whatever she was doing, it did not cost her anything visible. Ryan moved once more, but now the dynamic had fully transformed. This was no longer a demonstration, and everyone in the room understood it. Emily responded with the same quiet control, her movements consistent, exact, never excessive. Each step she took seemed to dissolve the space between action and reaction, leaving no room for error, no gap to exploit. Jason watched closely, his mind racing beneath the calm exterior he maintained so carefully. He had seen skill before. He had trained with experts, competed, taught, evaluated. But this was different. There was no performance here, no attempt to impress. Only clarity, only discipline, only control. The realization settled slowly but firmly. This woman, who had walked in unnoticed, who had been dismissed with a glance, was operating on a level that did not fit the assumptions he had made. And as that realization spread through the room, carried silently from one observer to another, the hierarchy that had once felt so solid began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The gym, once filled with noise and certainty, now held only stillness. And in that stillness, something irreversible had already begun. The stillness held, not fragile but heavy, like a truth pressing down on everyone at once, waiting to be acknowledged. Jason did not speak immediately. For the first time since the moment began, he allowed silence to stretch, his eyes fixed on Emily, as if searching for something he could name, something he could categorize, something that would return control back to him. But there was nothing obvious to grasp. No arrogance. No display. No signal that she wanted to prove anything at all. That absence unsettled him more than any show of dominance ever could. Ryan lowered his hands fully now, stepping back another half pace, his respect no longer subtle. You have trained before, he said, his voice calm, not accusing, not challenging, simply stating what had become undeniable. A ripple moved through the circle, quiet but charged, as if everyone had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Emily met his gaze, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady. For a moment, it seemed like she might not answer. Then she gave a small nod. A long time ago, she said. Her voice was soft, almost understated, but it carried clearly through the silence. Jason exhaled slowly, stepping fully onto the mat now, closing the distance until he stood just a few feet away from her. The room shifted again, attention tightening, every movement amplified. What level? He asked, his tone controlled, but no longer dismissive. It was a different question now, one that carried weight. Not a test, not a setup. I need to understand. Emily glanced briefly at the floor, then back up, her eyes steady. I stopped competing years ago, she replied. It was not an answer, not the one he had asked for. And yet, somehow, it was enough to deepen the tension instead of easing it. Jason studied her, longer this time, the pieces beginning to move into place in his mind, though not fully formed. He had seen competitors like her before, years ago, at regional events, at national tournaments, people who moved with that same quiet efficiency, that same absence of wasted motion. But those people had names, reputations, histories that followed them into every room. Emily Carter had walked in unnoticed. That did not fit. Again, Jason said, but this time his voice was different. Not commanding, not condescending, measured, intentional. Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded, stepping forward once more, though his posture had changed completely. There was no trace of demonstration left. Only focus, only engagement. Emily stepped in to meet him, her movement as calm as before, her presence unchanged, as if nothing about the situation required adjustment from her side. The exchange that followed was brief, but it carried a clarity that no one in the room could ignore. Ryan moved with precision, and Emily met him with something beyond precision. She did not rush. She did not force. She simply aligned, redirecting with minimal effort, her timing exact, her awareness complete. And then it ended. Not with a dramatic moment, not with impact, but with a quiet conclusion that left no doubt about what had just happened. Ryan stepped back again, this time fully, lowering his head slightly in acknowledgement, a gesture of respect that carried more weight than any reaction. The room could have given. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the ambient noise from the street outside seemed to fade into the background, as if the world itself had paused for just a moment. Jason felt it settle in, not as a shock, but as a realization he could no longer delay. This was not a beginner. This was not someone returning casually. This was someone who had once stood at a level he recognized, perhaps even above it, and he had tried to turn her into a joke. The thought lingered, heavy and unavoidable. Emily stepped back from the center of the mat, her posture still relaxed, her expression unchanged, as if none of this had required anything from her that she had not already carried long before she walked through those doors. She did not look around. She did not seek reaction. She simply waited, quiet and composed, while the room struggled to catch up to what it had just witnessed. And in that silence, the balance of the entire space had shifted, not with noise, not with force, but with something far more powerful. Understanding. No one clapped, no one spoke, and that absence of reaction said more than any applause ever could, because what they had just witnessed did not feel like a performance. It felt like a correction. Jason Blake stood motionless for a brief second longer than he intended, his authority no longer something he could lean on without question, his mind turning through possibilities that refused to settle into a comfortable explanation. He had built his reputation on reading people quickly, on knowing exactly where someone stood the moment they stepped onto his mat, and yet Emily Carter had slipped through that certainty without resistance, without effort, as if his judgment had never reached her at all. Around them, the students remained in place, but their posture had changed, subtly but unmistakably. The casual confidence that once filled the room had been replaced by something quieter, more attentive, more aware. A few exchanged glances, not to share amusement, but to confirm what they were all beginning to understand at the same time. Ryan stepped fully back into the circle, his role in the moment complete, but his eyes remained on Emily, thoughtful now, reflective, as if he were replaying every movement in his mind, searching not for mistakes, but for lessons. Jason finally broke the silence, though his voice no longer carried the same effortless dominance it had before. "Where did you train?" he asked, each word measured, careful, stripped of the earlier condescension. It was not a challenge anymore. It was a question rooted in respect, whether he wanted to admit it or not. Emily adjusted her stance slightly, her hands resting calmly at her sides again, her breathing unchanged, her presence as steady as when she first walked in. "Different places," she said simply. It was the kind of answer that offered nothing extra, nothing to build on, nothing to define her by. And yet, somehow, it carried weight precisely because of that. Jason studied her, searching her face for recognition, for any sign that he should know her name, that he had overlooked something obvious. But there was nothing there except quiet certainty, the kind that did not need to be announced. One of the senior students near the wall stepped forward slightly, unable to hold back any longer. "You competed," he said, his tone more certain than questioning. Emily's gaze shifted briefly toward him, then back to Jason. Another small nod. That was all. No explanation. No timeline. No accomplishments listed. Just acknowledgement. The room absorbed it in silence. Jason exhaled slowly, the realization settling deeper now, no longer a fleeting thought, but a fact he had to accept. He had not just underestimated her. He had misjudged her entirely. And worse, he had done it publicly, confidently, in front of the very people who trusted his judgment the most. The weight of that realization pressed in, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. He took a step back, creating space between himself and Emily, not as a retreat, but as a recalibration. "Class," he said, turning slightly, though his eyes remained on her for just a moment longer. "Take 5 minutes." The instruction broke the tension just enough for the room to breathe again. Students began to move, slowly at first, then with more natural motion, though their attention did not fully leave the center of the mat. Conversation started in low voices, careful, respectful, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt something important. Ryan walked past Emily, pausing briefly. "Thank you," he said quietly, a simple acknowledgement that carried genuine respect. Emily inclined her head slightly in return. No smile, no pride, just acceptance. Jason remained where he was, watching her as the room shifted around them, his earlier certainty replaced by something far more grounded. Awareness. He had spent years teaching discipline, control, and respect, but in a single unexpected moment, those same principles had been reflected back at him in a way he had not anticipated. Not through words, not through challenge, but through presence. Emily stepped off the mat as quietly as she had stepped onto it, moving toward the edge of the room without drawing attention, without claiming the moment that had just unfolded. But the room did not return to what it had been before. It could not. Because once something true is seen, it cannot be unseen. And in that space, filled now with a different kind of silence, everyone understood that what had just happened was not just a demonstration of skill. It was a reminder. And Jason Blake felt it more clearly than anyone. The gym did not return to normal. Not really. Even as students began moving again, stretching, whispering, pretending to resume their routines, because something invisible had shifted beneath everything they thought they understood. Conversations were quieter now, more deliberate, as if everyone was choosing their words with care, aware that whatever they said might reveal more about them than they intended. Emily stood near the edge of the mat, adjusting the sleeve of her hoodie slightly, her posture relaxed, her presence unchanged, as though none of the attention that had just passed through the room belonged to her at all. She did not look around to see who was watching. She did not need to. She already knew. Across the room, Jason remained still for a moment longer, watching her, the weight of his earlier assumptions settling into something far heavier than simple embarrassment. It was not just that he had been wrong. It was that he had been certain while being wrong, and that kind of certainty had consequences. He turned slowly, addressing the class again, his voice steady but different now, stripped of the sharp edge that had once defined it. "Pair up and continue drills," he said, though the instruction felt almost secondary to everything else that had just happened. The students obeyed, but their focus was divided, their attention drifting back toward Emily in quiet glances, their movements less automatic than before. Ryan returned to his place, though his posture remained thoughtful, his mind clearly elsewhere, replaying the exchange with a level of respect that had replaced any earlier assumptions. One of the newer students hesitated before stepping onto the mat, glancing briefly toward Emily as if seeing her for the first time, not as someone out of place, but as someone they did not yet understand. Jason walked toward her then, not quickly, not dramatically, but with intention. Each step measured, each movement controlled, though the purpose behind them had shifted. When he stopped a few feet away, there was no audience gathered this time, no circle, no expectation of performance. Just two people standing in the quiet space between noise and understanding. "I misjudged you," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, but clear, direct, without hesitation. The words hung in the air for a moment, simple, but not easy. Emily looked at him, her expression steady, her eyes calm, not cold, not forgiving, simply present. She did not rush to respond. She did not soften the moment or make it easier for him. She let the words exist as they were. "It happens," she said finally, her tone even, without bitterness, without pride, as if the statement applied to something much larger than just this room. Jason nodded once, absorbing it, though he understood that her response was not permission, not dismissal, just acknowledgement. He glanced briefly at the mat, then back at her. "You could teach here," he said, the offer coming out before he fully considered it, though it felt right the moment it was spoken. Not as a favor, not as a correction, as recognition. Emily held his gaze for a moment, then shook her head slightly. "I am not here for that," she replied. There was no explanation, no elaboration, just a boundary set with quiet certainty. Jason accepted it, though something in his expression shifted again, not disappointment, but understanding. He stepped back, giving her space, not out of formality, but out of respect he had not shown before. Around them, the class continued, but the energy was different now, more grounded, more aware, as if every student had been reminded of something they had almost forgotten. Emily turned slightly, her attention returning to the room, though not to claim it, not to lead it, just to be part of it on her own terms. And as Jason watched her step back into the quiet edge of the space, he realized that what she had shown them was not just skill. It was something far more difficult to teach, and far more difficult to learn. The rhythm of the gym slowly resumed, but it was no longer the same rhythm that had filled the room before Emily Carter stepped onto the mat. It was quieter, more deliberate, as if every movement now carried a layer of awareness that had not existed just an hour earlier. Students continued their drills, but the sharp confidence that once defined their motions had softened into something more thoughtful, more precise, as though they were no longer just repeating techniques, but questioning them, feeling them, understanding them differently. Emily remained near the edge of the training floor, watching without appearing to watch, her posture relaxed, her presence steady, blending into the background in a way that now felt intentional rather than accidental. She had returned to stillness, but it was no longer the unnoticed stillness of someone overlooked. It was the kind that drew quiet respect without asking for it. Across the room, Jason moved through the class, correcting stances, offering guidance, but his tone had shifted, stripped of the subtle edge that once separated him from his students. There was more patience now, more listening, as if he too had recalibrated something within himself. Each time he demonstrated a movement, there was a fraction of a pause afterward, a moment where he seemed to reconsider not just how something was done, but why. Ryan, paired with another advanced student, moved with a renewed focus, his earlier confidence now balanced by humility, his attention sharper, his movements cleaner, as though he had gained more from those brief moments with Emily than from weeks of routine training. At one point, he glanced toward her again, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of acknowledgement, as if silently recognizing a standard he had not yet reached but now understood existed. The rest of the class followed suit in quieter ways. Conversations between drills were softer, less about comparison, less about proving, more about learning. One student adjusted his stance more carefully, another slowed down her movements, both without realizing why, only sensing that something about rushing no longer felt right. The mirrors that lined the walls reflected not just bodies in motion, but a shift. In perspective, subtle but undeniable. Emily eventually stepped forward again, not to take control, not to draw attention, but simply to participate. She joined a basic drill with a newer student, her movements calm, measured, offering guidance without instruction, demonstrating without declaring. The student hesitated at first, clearly aware of who she was now, but Emily's presence eased that tension, grounding it, reminding them that what mattered was not status, but understanding. Jason noticed this from across the room, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary, not out of authority, but out of respect. He did not interrupt. He did not correct. He allowed it to happen, recognizing that whatever she was offering could not be replicated through command or structure. Time moved forward, but it felt different, as if the gym itself had absorbed something intangible and reshaped itself around it. The earlier laughter, the casual dismissiveness, the invisible lines between who belonged and who did not had all faded, replaced by something quieter, something steadier. And in the center of it all, without claiming attention, without seeking recognition, Emily Carter remained exactly who she had been from the moment she walked in, unchanged, unaffected, grounded in something far deeper than the opinions that had once surrounded her. The room no longer questioned her presence. It adjusted to it, and in that adjustment, something important had been restored, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that truth always finds its place. By the time the session drew to a close, the gym no longer felt like the same place it had been just an hour before, and no one needed to say it out loud for it to be true. The final drills ended not with the usual burst of chatter or casual laughter, but with a quieter kind of energy, one that carried reflection instead of noise. Students wiped down equipment, gathered their bags, and spoke in lower tones, their conversations less about who performed best and more about what they had learned, even if they did not fully understand what had changed. Emily Carter stepped away from the mat with the same quiet composure she had carried throughout the evening, pulling her hoodie sleeves down slightly as she moved toward the exit. She did not linger, did not wait for acknowledgement, and did not look back to measure the impact she had left behind. For her, this had not been a moment to prove anything. It had simply been a moment that happened. Near the front desk, Ryan paused as she passed, offering a small nod, one that carried genuine respect without needing words. She returned it just as simply, her expression steady, unchanged. Jason stood near the center of the gym, watching as the room gradually emptied, his usual position of control replaced by something quieter, something more internal. He had spent years building a space where structure defined value, where rank and visibility often shaped perception, but tonight had revealed something those systems could not measure. He walked slowly toward the exit, stopping a few feet from Emily as she reached for the door. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The evening light filtered through the glass, casting long reflections across the polished floor, softening the sharp edges of the space that had once felt so rigid. "You changed the room tonight," Jason said finally, his voice calm, without pretense, without authority, just acknowledgement. Emily rested her hand lightly on the door handle, considering his words for a moment before responding. "The room was already like that," she said quietly. "People just needed to see it." Her answer settled in the space between them, simple but undeniable. Jason nodded slowly, understanding more from that single sentence than from anything else that had been said that evening. It was not about her. It was never about her. It was about what people chose to see and what they chose to overlook. Emily opened the door, the cool evening air slipping into the gym, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city, cars passing, voices echoing faintly, life continuing beyond the walls that had just witnessed something quietly transformative. She stepped outside without hesitation, without pause, blending into the world beyond as naturally as she had entered it. Jason remained where he was, watching the door close, the reflection of his own figure faintly visible in the glass. Behind him, the gym stood quieter than usual, not empty, but changed. Its energy settled into something steadier, more grounded. The students who remained moved differently now, more aware, more intentional, as if they had been reminded of something they had forgotten to value. Jason turned back toward the mat, his gaze sweeping across the space he thought he understood completely, and, for the first time in a long time, he saw it differently. Not as a place where he defined others, but as a place where he, too, was still learning. And in that quiet realization, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would stay with him long after the lights dimmed and the doors closed. Because respect had not been demanded that night. It had not been claimed. It had simply revealed itself, in silence, in discipline, in the quiet presence of someone who never needed to prove anything at all. And that was something no one in that room would forget.